We'll start the recording and we'll get started with our workshop. So welcome everybody to Job Search 360 Interview Basics. So our presentation today has a number of goals. First, to learn about typical interview processes and different types of interviews. Second, to learn how to prepare for common interview questions. Third, learn some tips for video interviews, because these days that's the modality that most interviews are being conducted in. And finally, how to master follow-up after an interview. And one thing I'll note, I see that we have a mix here of MA and PhD students. And for PhD students, most of the examples that I give here will be for non-academic jobs. So that's kind of the focus of the presentation, but all of the takeaways are applicable for any kind of job you would apply to. So it would still apply to academic positions. And I'm happy to answer specific questions about that too, if you all have any. Okay, so first, introduction to interviewing. Why are you even, what's the point of an interview? Why are you getting interviewed? So when you apply for a job and you submit a resume and cover letter, the point of those documents is to get you to the interview stage. And so once an employer has decided that they want to interview you, it's because their interest is piqued by the materials that you've submitted. And now they want a chance to further evaluate your skills, experience, and your motivation for working in that position and that company. And they also need to assess whether you will mesh well with the company's culture. So they're also assessing your interpersonal skills, your interests, and the general way that you present yourself. So I think one of the best ways to be a successful interviewer is, as much as possible, try to put yourself in the employer's shoes and in the interviewer's shoes. And that goes for trying to understand the questions they're asking you and just thinking about the whole interview process and why you're there. But also as an interviewee, you have some control over this process too. And there are a few things that you should be thinking about because you're kind of testing out the company too. So you should be paying close attention to the work environment. So assessing and observing the behaviors you see in your interviewers and how they interact with one another if you get to a stage of the interview where you're being interviewed by a panel. These days, you're probably not doing too many in-person interviews. Typically we say, look at the office space, pay attention to what you're seeing. And that'll help you get a sense for the culture and what it might be like to work there too. And even though you might not be able to see that right now, since most interviews are still online, you can still even, if you see something behind people, or you can just kind of get a sense for the visual presentation, what you're seeing as well. And then also, we'll talk about this later, but you should come into every interview with a list of questions that you want to ask. And those questions should do a number of things. And one of those things is to help you determine if it's the right fit for you, if the position is the right fit, and if the organization is the right fit. So you should come up with questions that'll help you assess that. Okay, so what is a typical interview process? So I'll just give the caveat that it is highly variable from company to company. Obviously, the academic interview process is completely different. But usually an interview process has multiple steps, and usually the first round is a screening. So it's usually short. It is hardly ever in person. It's usually actually either over the phone or in a video interview. And it is sometimes not even with the hiring manager. So not even with the person who would be your boss, but sometimes it's with somebody from human resources or, someone who you wouldn't be actually working with on a daily basis if you were to get the job. Then there's usually a middle round where you would speak with the hiring manager. And so that's like the person who would be your boss. And that could either be one-on-one also, or it might be with a couple of different people. It could be 30 minutes with one person, 30 minutes with another person. It could be 45 minutes with 3 people. There are different forms it takes, but that's kind of what a middle round is. And then there's usually a final round after that is longer. And this can look really different depending on the kind of role and what the company process is. So sometimes you'll meet with multiple people. There might be multiple meetings scheduled. Might be something what's called a super day, which happens in finance and consulting, where it used to be really a whole day and you would go into the office for a whole day. And sometimes you'd even meet other prospective candidates too. It could be a group interview. It might also involve a presentation. So for an academic job, that would be a job talk. When I was interviewing for my job, I had to do a presentation saying what my vision for this office would be, and I've had to do that sometimes too. So that could be in the last step. But I do just want to say, I usually for a full-time job, interview processes are at least 3 rounds. Sometimes it can be more than that. So I'll say this later too, but a good thing to ask whenever you're interviewing is at the end, when you have the opportunity to ask questions, ask what's the next step in the process, or what is this process going to look like, and know that at the outset. Okay, so I just alluded to this, but there are many different types of interviews. The one we'll focus on today are general behavioral interviews, and these focus on your background, on your interests and strengths, and your prior experience. In addition to that, there are many other kinds of interviews. So there are technical interviews, and this is for folks if you're applying for jobs in tech or quantitative jobs or software engineer, things like that. There will be a part of the process that will test your technical skills. We don't do those practice interviews here, but we can give you some resources to see what some sample questions might be for technical interviews. And the one piece of advice I'll give is that for technical interviews, it's not only, sometimes it is really just like a test that's assessing your skills, and that would be like the online skills assessment, but it's also testing your analytical process. So it's not entirely about whether you get the answer right or wrong, but how you work through the questions you're being asked and what your thought process is. If you're applying in the consulting industry, case interviews are common, and this is where you'll be given a sample business problem, and you'll spend up to 45 minutes working through that problem with consultants who work at the company, as a process that's kind of a back and forth, and really they're trying to see your problem solving skills and how you think on your feet. And there are many resources for practicing with consulting case interviews. In addition, brain teasers are also common in consulting and also finance or tech. And again, they're gonna, it's like the how many tennis balls fit in an airplane kind of question. So they're assessing how you can think on your feet and how you might approach complex problems. And so this is about showing your work by thinking about your thought process, or by voicing your thought process out loud. Group interviews. So this could be a number, as a final round interview where all of the finalists are invited to come, and really they're assessing how you interact with others. So usually you'll be observed during these group interviews. You might be asked to work as a team to solve a problem or answer a question. And they're very closely observing how you interact with others, your leadership style, how you collaborate with others, and how well you listen too. So it's very important during those group interviews to realize you're being assessed the entire time. So you have to think really carefully about how you're interacting with the other folks in that interview. And finally, task or project interviews. So this is what I mentioned, how like doing a presentation, or maybe you might be given, sometimes you're even given homework between different interview rounds. So they might give you an assignment to do, such as create a public relations campaign or design a product launch. And you'll have to submit something in writing. And then for the last round interview, you'll have to talk through it or present it. So that's another, can be another common part of a job interview. Okay, so those are all of the types. And now we'll talk about how to prepare. So first, you can help to set yourself up by asking some questions when you get invited to an interview. So first, find out who will be interviewing you. So you can ask that politely if they don't tell you. Would you mind? And so you could just say in an email, thank you so much. I'm very glad to be interviewing. Would you mind sharing with me the names of the individuals who will be interviewing me? And then if they don't give you the job titles, kind of regardless, you should look those people up to see what their role is and look up their LinkedIn profile so you can see a bit about their background. And it's really, a really nice touch is if you address them by their first name when you meet them. Obviously, if it's an online interview, you have the advantage of a little name below, but it's a nice touch. Second, what technology do they plan to use? They'll probably share this with you, but obviously, there are tons of different options. So just make sure you know ahead of time. And if it's possible, if it requires a software download, it's great to do that in advance and see if you can click on the link to make sure it works in advance. So those are things to do before an interview that involve the employer. Now, what should you do? A lot of research. So first, you want to learn as much about the company and the position and that industry as possible. So this is not just looking at the company's website, which you want to scour it. You want to see everything that's available on the website. You can look at them on social media. You want to be following them on LinkedIn, Google, do a Google News search for the company to see if they've been in the news lately. Then, beyond just the company, think about that industry. So, again, make sure that you're aware of any big headlines. If you're in finance, what has the Fed said is going to happen? There's always news there. So just make sure that you're up on whatever the latest news and events would be, that would be something your employer would be attuned to. If you can, do some informational interviews before your job interview. So that would be speaking to people in the organization or in the industry to get insider knowledge. Probably is too hard. You probably won't have enough time to do that if you've already been invited for an interview. But if you do have a contact or somebody who who's been helping you in your search, reach out to that person and say, hey, I have an interview in 2 days. Could we have a quick phone call beforehand to hash it out? That's really helpful. Research the industry and company-specific interview questions. So we'll talk about that in a bit. And then there are a lot of, these are basic resources. So Firsthand is something that you can link to. It's a subscription-based service that we have, obviously LinkedIn, and then Glassdoor. I think Joe will be putting multiple links to all of these sources in the chat as we go. These are some good basic resources to help you with this research. So the other part is self-reflection. And this is to prepare you for some particular interview questions and just in general, so that you come off as genuinely interested and genuinely, with a really genuine confidence about your ability to fulfill this role. So first, why do you want this job? They will ask you will be asked throughout your interview process why you want this job, and you need to have a great answer. And it should be not only why you want this job, but also why you want to work at this company. And so you should have an answer that feels very true, and that's also well researched. So next, think about your skills, personal qualities, your academic, professional, volunteer experiences, and how they relate to this position and make you a good candidate. So what I do before every job interview actually is I print out my resume, because I know that they have that document. And then I also print out the job description. And I'll take the job description and my resume and make notes on both documents. And even with the job description, I go through every qualification and every responsibility even, and I put a little note about something in my past experience or some quality about myself that I think is relevant and helps to make a case for my candidacy. So I do that before every job interview. I print out the job description and I make those notes. And that's something that's really just about self-reflection. It's not any external research. So then last, and this is what we'll talk about next, create a narrative around these stories about yourself using the STAR method. I'll say what that acronym stands for in a minute, to convey your qualifications to the employer. Okay, so now let's look at some common interview questions. And first, I just would love to get each of you to type in the chat, and you can type as many questions as you want, but what's your most challenging interview question or your most dreaded interview question? So either something you've already been asked that was really hard, or just a question you're nervous about having to answer in a job interview. So feel free to put that in the chat, and you can read one another's answers too. I encourage all participants to do that. Okay, so the first question that you will be asked, I guarantee it, is tell me about yourself. And this is, you're going to be asked this question when you're networking, you're asked this question, when you meet someone new in a professional or academic context. But this is basically your elevator pitch. It's a concise introduction to you and to your background and experience. And your answer to this question is probably a little bit different every single time you deliver it, because it should be specific. You should say the relevant parts of your experience for your audience that you're talking to. So in that sense, you would highlight different elements of your experience depending on who you're introducing yourself to. So obviously, like if you're introducing yourself to a new friend, you might say, you might say where you're from. You might say, if you have siblings, you might say where you went to dinner last night. But in a professional context, so like if you're interviewing for a job as a data analyst, obviously you wouldn't say any of those things and tell me about yourself. Instead, you would say, you'd want to talk about your education and any relevant professional or project experience you have. Okay, great. So I see one question in the chat from Shauna first. Okay, another question. Okay, why do you want to work here? Give me okay, great. These are great questions. What are the challenges you've faced? Great. 3 disadvantages, or the weakness question. Yep, great. Yep, so all of these are good common interview questions, and we'll talk about these and more in a minute. Okay, so the tell me about yourself is basically your elevator pitch, and this is something you really want to practice beforehand. I suggest you do it in front of a mirror, or videotape yourself, record yourself, or just do it, as you're walking. We're practicing this. So what's your name? You start with current. So I'm a graduate student in, X program at Columbia. I'll be graduating in December. And then the relevant, so this is the hard part here, highlights from your experience in terms of relevant knowledge or skills developed. And so this is where you really want to think about what's relevant for the job. And that's what you're going to say in introducing yourself. So you might say, I'm a graduate student in history. I'm going to be graduating in May. I'm, and then if you're applying, say, for a higher ed administrative job, during graduate school, I've had a lot of experience organizing conferences, or as a student government representative. And I've gotten, this is in addition to my dissertation work, and I've gotten very interested in blah, 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 blah. So again, like you're going to say the things that are most relevant for that audience that you're introducing yourself to. And thanks. Yeah, so Joe just put in the chat a link to elevator pitches. This is from LinkedIn Learning. You can even just look on YouTube for examples of people delivering an elevator pitch. So second, and actually someone put this as a difficult question, why are you interested in working for this company and in this role? So again, you will definitely be asked this. And you have to have, and that's a 2-part answer. So why the company, and then why that role, and you need to think of reasons for both. So your answer should be enthusiastic and authentic. And so not just kind of reciting the company's mission, but having a way of actually tying it to you and why that speaks to you. You need to do your research so that you can answer that question, because if you don't know very much about the company, then you simply can't have an enthusiastic and authentic answer to that. And also, again, to understand really what the role is, because this is also where they're testing you. If you say something that doesn't align with either the company's mission, or if what you say about why you want this role doesn't really align with what the role is, that's going to be a red flag. So if you say, I really want to be, making, business decisions for this company, and it's a like a data analyst role, like that's probably more of like a junior, you're going to be crunching data that will contribute to other people's decision making, but you're not going to be making the decisions yourself. So that's just one example of like really understanding both the company and the role. And when you answer this question, you want to connect it to your own career trajectory. So this is almost like a second part of your elevator pitch, that it's in answering why you want to work for this company in this role. You say, you know, this is why I want to work here, and this is why I want this role. And again, like these are the parts of my background and experience that make me a great fit for both. So someone said a difficult question is, why do you want to work at this consulting company? And I think that part of maybe I'm guessing why that's difficult is because a lot of the, especially like the big consulting companies are kind of similar, like, and that can be true of big, you know, many large companies are, you know, it might not be that different working at one as opposed to another. And that's where your research comes in, where you really have to, you know, so look at the website, see, you know, are there projects that you know that they've worked on? Is there something that they've been in the news about? Have you spoken to somebody who's worked there, who has said really great things about it? Is there something that they say on their website about their approach or the work environment or the work style that really appeals to you? Is it a company that has made the news for really valuing work-life balance, maybe, and has done, you know, gone to great lengths? So you just need to do research to come up with something that is enthusiastic and authentic and specific to that company. Okay, so now behavioral interview questions. What is a behavioral interview question? These questions focus on the candidate's past experience by asking them to provide specific examples of how they've demonstrated certain behaviors, knowledge, skills, and abilities. So they tend to be pointed, probing, and specific. So it would be usually, you know, you're being asked a behavioral interview question when the question begins with, tell me about a time when you did X, or when you faced X, or tell me about a time, and this is where, you know, people put this in the chat. Can you give an example that demonstrates who you are as a researcher? That's behavioral. Tell me about a challenge you faced in a previous job. That's also behavioral. And so again, putting yourself in the interviewer's shoes, why are they asking you this question? They're asking you this question because they want to know, if you work here and you are faced with a challenge, how are you going to handle that? And the best way to assess that is by hearing a really detailed story from you about a time when you've done that in the past, and then see how you tell that story, how you behaved, and how you reflect on that experience. So that's why they're asking these questions. So these behavioral interview questions basically all try to get at a skill or quality. These are, you know, according to surveys of employers, these are the top 12 skills that employers seek in job candidates: problem solving, teamwork, communication, leadership, work ethic, analytic or quantitative skills, communication skills, initiative, detail-oriented, et cetera, et cetera. And so basically, you know, people often ask for samples of behavioral interview questions, and there are tons of them, and Joe has put some links in the chat. You can just Google it and find lists too, but this is, yeah, Joe's put some great links in the chat. But really, each behavioral interview question is trying to get at probably one or a couple of these 12 skills. So in preparing, you have no idea, you know, there are infinite questions that you could be asked during a job interview, but in the end, they're probably assessing a narrower range of skills. So in preparing for behavioral interviews, you can prepare stories that speak to, you know, a certain set of skills, and then be able to use those stories for a variety of different specific questions from the interviewer. And how might you know, among these 12 skills, what's most valued? Read the job description and do your research on the company and learn the company culture. That's how you're going to know, what to really focus on in your preparation. So, okay, here, again, like really common behavioral questions. Tell me about a time when you had to step up and be a leader, when you used creativity to solve a particularly challenging problem in a creative way. when you worked with a difficult supervisor or coworker, when you had to persuade someone in a position of authority, all of these are all examples of behavioral interview questions. Okay, so how do you answer these? So there's a technique that can help you to answer these. And I think this will even get at some of the questions that people have put in the chat too. Because really the point of it, so like Shauna wrote, the difficult question is talk about a challenge you faced or a weakness. And so then the question is, how do you answer a question like this without actually making yourself look unqualified or like an undesirable candidate in some way? And the answer to that is I think really in how well you apply this STAR method. Okay, so what does STAR stand for? The S stands for situation. So this is how, whenever you answer a behavioral interview question, this is how you structure your answer to that question. So first you want to describe the situation. So lay it out for, the interviewer wasn't there. So if the question is, describe a challenge you faced, what was the challenge? So just describe, it was in this internship, this was the project, this was the challenge. So then the task, what did you either individually or as a team decide to do to respond to the situation? So after setting the stage for the situation, then what was it that you actually decided that you had to do? Next, A stands for action. So what action did you take? So now you're narrating what you did. And this is also where it's important to say what you did. And so even if this is something that you were working on as a team, you want to clarify the things that you did to contribute to the team. And then as well as other team members too, but really emphasizing your own role on the team. And then finally, the result. And so I think the letter R, the result, is really where some of these concerns about asking those, answering those questions about challenges or weaknesses, that it's really important to make sure you wrap up the story with the result or the outcome, and also a reflection about that. So a reflection about how you handled the whole situation. And so that's where, even if something, you might be asked, tell me about a time you made a mistake. And the question about the mistake is actually really more about not, the mistake itself, like, oh no, you really messed up by, getting, using the wrong financial model on something, and, your results were terrible. It's not about the mistake, but it's about how you fixed it, or how you dealt with it, or how you responded to feedback or criticism. So that's really what that question is about. And so same thing with the challenge, or same thing with the weakness, that it's not so much about what is that actual weakness, but it's what do you do to overcome it or to compensate for it, and to show that you have that awareness about yourself. So I see some questions in the chat too about LinkedIn Learning. So actually those links, you might actually put in the chat, Joe, the CUIT link. I don't know if you know where to find that, but LinkedIn Learning is a subscription-based service. And it's not just even if you have a LinkedIn account, but if it's even on top of that, you need to log in with your UD and password, and two different ways. So if you log into your GSAS Connect profile, click on resources and go to the resource library, you'll see LinkedIn Learning in there. And then that will actually take you, there you go, a CUIT site, and you click on the link at the CUIT site, and then that'll prompt you to enter your UD or password, and you'll be in LinkedIn Learning. And once you're logged into LinkedIn Learning, then all of these links should open up for you. So it's a fantastic resource, LinkedIn Learning. Okay, so this is the STAR technique. Again, situation, task, action, result. And when you're first, when you're practicing, when you're preparing for your interview, try actually, taking notes on some of this. So put an interview question there, tell me about a challenge you faced, and then lay it out: situation, task, action, result, and actually take notes on it until and that's a really great way to prepare for answering a question like that. Actually, I think before I go on to interview questions, just want to reiterate a point that I made before about, because I get this question all the time about preparation, and people want to see lists of behavioral interview questions and want to prepare for every possible question they might be asked, but that is really impossible. So another thing that behavioral interviews are testing is also your ability to think on your feet. So again, like there are all these different skills here. You want to have ready a handful of stories from different professional, academic, volunteer experiences in your life. So you want to have some stories ready to tell. But then the other thing you're going to need to do on your feet is when you're asked a question, you're going to need to figure out which prepared story you can tell to answer that question. So I just kind of want to emphasize that's kind of how you should be thinking about the preparation, and having ready, and then also having that STAR template in your mind too, so that you might be asked a question you actually don't have any prepared stories that answer that question. And if that happens, one common kind of delaying technique is to say, like that's a great question. Let me take a moment to think of a good example. To say that so that you buy yourself a little bit of time so that you can think of a story to tell. And as you're thinking of the story, and then kind of structuring it on the spot, you're doing this situation, task, action, result structure. One other thing, and I give this advice sometimes, that if you draw a complete blank during an interview and you really cannot think of a story, what would you do in that situation? So what I recommend, and you can really only do this probably once during an interview, but answer it hypothetically. So a behavioral interview is, the question will ask you, tell me about a time when you did something. And if you really can't think of something, you can say, well, I'm having trouble thinking of a good example of this, but let me tell you what I would do. And then walk through like a hypothetical situation and say, because I know that this is really important for this role to be able to do this. I can't think of an example, but let me walk through what I think this would look like, if I were faced with this. So that's, if you really draw a blank and can't think of an example, you can do that too. But again, I would only recommend doing that probably one time in an interview. Okay, so there are some illegal interview questions, questions that interviewers aren't allowed to ask you. So they can't ask you about your age, religion, national origin, marital status, whether you have children, whether you have a disability, your sexual orientation. And then in New York State, they're not allowed to ask about your salary at your prior job. So just know that there are certain things that are off limits. And what do you do if you get asked these? So first, if it's something that really, kind of offends you, you can say, I don't feel it's relevant to the position or this interview. So that's one thing you can say. Or you could address, again, like kind of thinking about the behavioral, like approaching it from a behavioral interview perspective, what are the concerns behind the question? So if it's like, what is your national origin, or where are you, what is your citizenship? You can just say, I am authorized to work in the United States. Similarly, like, do you have a disability? Really, they're probably wondering, can you perform this job? And so address that instead. I have no issues that would keep me from effectively carrying out this job. So it's not common to be asked these questions, but it's good to be prepared and know what is not appropriate to be asked. Okay, so the next thing that you want to do in your preparation is prepare questions to ask the interviewer. So pretty much every interview will end with, okay, now do you have any questions for me? So this is an opportunity not only to, ask those like very real questions you do have to determine whether the job is a good fit, but this is also kind of a test, and they want to see that you're asking thoughtful questions that can't be answered, very obviously on the organization's website. So you don't want to ask something that's, that you could have just looked up, that you should already know, basically. It could be nice to, you can reference the website. You can say like, oh, I saw on the website that the company is headed in this direction or has this strategic goal. Can you tell me more about that? Or can you tell me about how that would impact my work if I were to work here? So something that's nice to reference the website, but also ask, again, like questions that you actually have that would help you determine if this is going to be a good place to work. So what's the orientation process for new hires? What's the onboarding process like? So you could kind of gauge what that would be like there. What kind of training and professional development is offered, and mentorship. So these are all good questions. What would be the top priority for the next 3 months, 6 months, and first year of the role? So these are all good kinds of questions to ask. So you definitely want to go into every interview prepared with at least 2 to 3 questions to ask. And then in bold at the bottom, and I mentioned this before, you always want to ask, if they haven't already shared this, what is the next step in the process, or the next several steps in the process if you're early on. So you absolutely have a right to ask that. And then also the second part of that, what is the timetable for notifying candidates of their status? So that way, it can be helpful to you if they say, you're the first person we've interviewed. It'll take us a couple of weeks to get back to you. That'll give you peace of mind, so you won't be checking your email every 5 minutes and wondering why they haven't gotten back to you yet. Also, just so you can prepare if they say, oh, the next step in the process is a presentation or is a written exercise or something, or a technical interview, just so that you know what to expect. So you should absolutely ask that if you don't know the answer. Okay, so we're nearing the end here. So video interview, you've all probably pretty much mastered this now in the last year and a half, but basically quiet, private, well-lit location with a neutral background, fast, reliable internet. I'll just say if your background isn't neutral, and if you're on Zoom, you can do the thing where you make your background fuzzy, blurry. So that's a good thing you can do, or use a virtual background. Try to have light that's in front of you. So currently I have a lamp that's actually like right behind my computer to illuminate my face, or do it facing a window, but not with a window behind you. Test your computer audio and webcam. Even if it always works, just test it right before, just in case. Close anything that might be distracting on your computer, or things that might slow your computer down if you have any big programs running. And it's always good to have a copy of your resume handy, because they will be looking at your resume, whether it's printed out or you have it open, the file open on your computer. And then I do think it's always a good idea to have pen and paper, so you can take notes, especially if you're in like a case interview or something. But you just take notes so that you don't lose your train of thought too. If they ask like a 2-part question, you can take notes on that. So I would definitely have a pen and a notepad with you as well. One piece of advice that I have given to several students lately in mock interviews is to consider not sitting in a swivel chair. Because I've noticed when you're nervous, sometimes people have a tendency to swivel, and that is distracting, and that's not good body language. So if you have a tendency to swivel or fidget, I suggest that you don't use a swivel chair and sit in a stable chair that does not swing. Okay, what to wear still matters in a video interview. The 3 Ps: polished, professional, and proper fit, at least from the waist up. So here are some examples, a nice blouse, something that's clean, maybe a collar. You can also just assess the company culture. So like, you don't want to be wearing a jacket and tie if it's a super informal company, because they'll be assessing that and they'll say, like, this person is, I'm not sure that's kind of an odd choice for this company. But on the flip side, if it's a very informal company, I wouldn't wear a hoodie to a job interview. You still want to wear something that's polished. So even if you were to get the job there, you'd wear a sweatshirt every day, don't wear the hoodie in your interview. Dress a little nicer than that. Okay, body language on camera. Okay, so this is kind of tricky. in order to mimic eye contact, you need to look at the camera. So right now I'm looking right at the camera and you might feel like I'm making eye contact with you. But if I'm looking to see the audience, and you can see that I'm not, now I feel like Joe, I'm looking at you. I'm looking at Joe, but it looks like I'm looking away. So just keep in mind about that. And so when you're speaking, try to look into the camera because it looks like you're making eye contact. And then when you're listening, you can look at the person, but it feels unnatural. So you'll need to practice it to look at the webcam. Keep your mood upbeat and convey optimism in your body language. So try to sit with your back straight and shoulders open, feet planted on the floor. Try to use, hand gestures to the extent that you're comfortable. Nod and smile when you're listening to communicate that you're paying attention. It can be a little hard to read all of these nonverbal cues on video. So they have to be a little bit exaggerated, more so than if you were in person. And yeah, use hand gestures, but try not to use like wild and crazy hand gestures or knock over any beverages. And then try to avoid fidgeting or letting your gaze drift far away from the device. And this is another thing that you might want to practice. I see, especially when students get nervous, when anybody gets nervous, sometimes people have a tendency to look around or to look at the ceiling or to look to the side. And just, try not to do that. Try to keep your head facing the camera. If things go wrong, things do go wrong sometimes. So if your audio or video stops working, so it's always good practice before the interview, I gave a disclaimer. I said, my Zoom sometimes completely shuts down. And I told you what to do in case that happens. So and if you're really nervous about that something happening, you could at the beginning of the interview or even before the interview, when you're asking about what the modality would be, you could say, is there a phone number I could have just in case there are technical difficulties to make sure that I can reach the interviewer? If noise interrupts the conversation, you live in New York, there's a lot of noise. If it's something small, don't worry about it. But if it's really loud, just say, I'm sorry, there's an ambulance going by. I'm just going to mute myself for a minute until that noise subsides. And so then mute, wait, and then continue. If somebody enters the room unexpectedly, so apologize. And this part is really important. Make sure you both mute yourself and turn off your camera before you deal with the situation. So say, I'm so sorry, there's an interruption. Can you hold on for a moment? And then mute, turn off your camera, and then do it. They don't want to they don't want to hear you or see you, screaming at your roommate because they came in during your job interview. That looks pretty unprofessional. So just make sure that you, again, mute, turn off your camera, make sure the room is clear and secure, that you are calm, and then turn both back on. Pre-recorded interviews. So this is another thing that's become really common, which is you might not even talk to a human being in your first round of interviews. It might be a screening where you get a set of questions that you need to record yourself, that you need to record your answers to. So there are lots of different platforms that do this. Again, it's usually an early round. They're usually pretty short. It might just be a few questions. Usually you are able to test beforehand and know whether there's a time limit for your answers. And usually you can, test the tech beforehand. So just make sure that you do that. Make sure you follow, that you know what the time limit will be and that you do perform the interview within, the time that they give you to do it. So obviously that can feel pretty unnatural to not be speaking with a person. You'll get nothing, you'll get no feedback. You won't get someone looking at you and nodding. So try to imagine you're having a live conversation and, take advantage of the fact that you might be able to prepare a little bit more. You can have notes in front of you. Again, just try to direct your gaze. And this, again, direct your gaze at the webcam as much as possible when you're answering these pre-recorded questions, but you can have notes either on the screen or written on a piece of paper in front of you. Okay, COVID-19 specific interview questions. They might ask, this is basically just, they might ask you about working remotely. And so you might want to, when you're preparing for a behavioral interview, have a story about remote work and how you did it. Okay, so after the interview, this is the end of the presentation. You want to send a thank you note within 24 hours. Actually, I should have edited that slide. This is at least 24 hours after. It should be within 24 hours after the interview. And so that thank you note should be clear, concise, it should be short, express gratitude for their time, for the opportunity to interview. It's really nice if you can mention specific aspects of the interview. So, thank you for sharing. I was really interested to learn X about the company. I really appreciate you sharing that. If you feel like you need to kind of compensate for something that happened, you can do that in the thank you note. Let me know if you'd like to hear more about something, or let me know if you have any questions about X internship that we talked about. You can say that. It's also an opportunity, to add something that you might not have mentioned. So if you finish the interview feeling like I forgot to mention something, or, oh, I did this one thing wrong, or I should have said that, you can say a little something. You can have a sentence or two about it in your thank you note. Like, I've been thinking about that question you asked, and I realized, I could have shared a story about this. You don't tell the whole story, but just one line, and that kind of shows that you really are taking it seriously, that you're sincerely interested. So that is something you can do in the thank you note. But really, you don't want the thank you email. It should be 1 to 2 short paragraphs. Here's a sample subject line for the email. Thank you for the interview. Oh yeah, and this should be an email. It used to be that you sometimes would mail it, but now with COVID, like if you send something by mail, they probably won't get it. So it should definitely be an email. And if possible, email the person who you interviewed with. So even if someone else is scheduling the interview for you, email the person or people you actually spoke to, as well as the person who scheduled it for you. You can thank them for scheduling it. So, dear Mr. Shinohara, I want to thank you for interviewing me yesterday for this position. I enjoyed learning, and then again, my background in research labs. So again, emphasizing highlights of your experience. And as president of the student group Women in Science Columbia, I believe my skills and experiences have prepared me for this role. I'm specifically interested in the professional development opportunities this position offers, or maybe you could say the professional development opportunities that you mentioned during the interview. Thank you again for the opportunity to discuss my candidacy. I look forward to hearing from you. Then, what if you don't hear anything? Unfortunately, I'm hearing from more and more students that they're getting ghosted after interviews. And that's unfortunate. I think it's not the best practice. I think a company that interviews you owes you a rejection if they're not going to hire you. But we are hearing from students that sometimes they're not getting contacted again after an interview. But first, I would say just be patient. And this is again where if you ask ahead of time, when can I expect to hear back from you? And they tell you this is going really slowly, like don't expect to hear back from us anytime soon. That's helpful information. So first, be patient. If 2 weeks have gone by since the interview and you have not heard anything, then it's appropriate to send a follow-up email, something very short like this. Thank you again for the opportunity. I am writing to inquire about the status of my application. That's a good phrase to use. Any information would be appreciated. If you don't hear back from that, you can send one more follow-up email, and I would say like 1 week later, and just to see if they can tell you about your status. Okay, so that's the end of the presentation. I am going to stop sharing and stop the recording.